I think most of us know Jeanne Snodgrass well, especially after that last school board election. But she is here today, um, I guess, because of her background as executive director of Hillel on the university campus. Jeanne is a busy lady. She has an MFA, Master's of Fine Arts. She also has an MAJS, which is a Master's of Jewish Studies. She has extensive experience in arts and nonprofit organizations and community outreach and education. And along with her husband, Dave, was an independent business owner. He still is. She's an active member of Columbia's Congregation Beth Shalom, where her three daughters teach and attend religious school. Jeanne is interested in the performance of Jewishness and social justice and the ways we find connections to Judaism in a diverse and pluralistic society. And then the relationship those of us that are Jewish build with one another. In addition to her Hillel work, she's about to complete rabbinic studies, I believe next December. And then it goes into her school board. Being a member of the school board, she enjoys dancing, reading, hiking, and occasionally revisiting old knitting projects. She really loves her work with students on the university campus and works to build meaningful Jewish programming there. Thanks for being here, Jeanne, and giving us kind of another view after last week's presentation from George Smith and friends. Thanks.
Sure. I'm really glad to be here. I'll give just, I want to give a little bit more background and also sort of what I'm going to address and also what I'm not going to address, because I think that that's important to just sort of lay it out front. One, I want to note that my experiences in my job obviously inform the things that I'm doing, but I'm not speaking on behalf of any organization. And I do want to be really clear about that. As Alice mentioned, I have a master's in Jewish studies. I'm also in the process of receiving rabbinic ordination through a program called Pluralistic Rabbinical Seminary. I also have quite a bit, in part from this job, but also prior to the job I've had, have had lots of opportunities to travel to Israel, and in not the last time I went, but 2 times prior to that, also to go into the West Bank, to meet with Palestinians in Ramallah, to meet with folks in what they're calling a new Palestinian city called Rawabi, which is outside near to Ramallah, and including and in Nazareth, with folks there, and sorry, not Nazareth, Bethlehem, and also to be able to speak with officials from the Palestinian Authority, from the PA, which was a really unique experience. Both of those trips were with groups of students from the university, Jewish and non-Jewish students, and we went specifically to look at the political situation. The last time I was there for that particular trip was in the summer of 2022. The last time I was back in Israel was in the winter, not this most recent past winter break, but the winter break before that. So just to sort of give some context, I've done some extended study there. I studied abroad in college. That was actually the same year Rabin was assassinated, and there were a series of bus bombings. And so I was in Jerusalem while many of those bombings were happening. I went back in the summer of 2004, which was also during one of the intifadas. There was another series of bombings for an extended summer program, and then have been, like I said, back and forth a number of times. In the 11 years that I've had this position, I've been over, I think, 12 or 13 times for some shorter trips. So I just to sort of give that context, and I try really hard when I'm over there to speak to as many people as possible. Want to also really emphasize that there is no single Jewish view on what is happening or how the events of October 7th have affected folks, just like there is no single Palestinian view or Arab view or Muslim view, right? There is a lot of diversity, I think, within the community. And so what I wanted to do was address some of the things that I think are concerns for a lot of folks within both the American Jewish community, but also that I have heard from Israelis, from colleagues, from family, from folks that are over there when they think about what happens next, right? What is the context for the things that are happening, and what are these possibilities? And I know that was a question. I did have an opportunity to watch the recording from last week's, which I really appreciated. And I know that was a question that a number of people had in terms of like sort of thinking about like what are next steps in terms of what can we do as Americans, who, you know, the US does have a big influence on that foreign policy. And also how does everyone kind of move forward from things that go on. And so I'm going to try, I don't have a PowerPoint, sorry, it's Passover just started, there's been a lot going on, but going to do my best to sort of keep it as concise as possible, while also really emphasizing that I think we have to recognize that there is nuance in this conversation. And I'll just say that I have personally been sort of chastised by folks with very opposing views on this particular topic, for trying to say that this is a complicated, nuanced conversation. But I truly believe it is, right? There are a lot of different pieces, and there are a lot of people and a lot of peoples and groups with a lot of history of trauma and real concerns for personal safety. And I think it's important to recognize that because, in my personal opinion, any solution moving forward is going to have to really address those concerns from all the different groups. So one thing I want to start with is just to sort of frame a little bit. I think something that is important is we do need to think about what was happening before October 7th. And I think that for a number of reasons. I think it provides a context that can help to understand how different groups reacted to what happened. And by that, I'm talking about both Palestinian in Israel, Palestine, West Bank, Gaza, but also in America, because I think that the reality is that we live here. You know, as Rasha also noted, you know, like she lives here, not there. I live here, not there, right? So this is my perspective as a Jewish American living here. One, I think we can go back and we should think about like, what is the history? So we can go back to 1948, the establishment of the State of Israel. We can also go back further. So around 1912, when the British were given the mandate for Palestine it was taken from the Ottoman Turks. That mandate included what was called at the time Mandatory Palestine, which encompasses what is right now the State of Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza. And it also included what at the time was called Transjordan. And the reason that I think it's important to mention this is because many of the early talks, when they were discussing how do we divide this up, how can we create a homeland for both Arabs that are living here and Jews that are looking to come here or are already living here, because Jews had been there for this entire time. The area of Transjordan, now the country of Jordan, is about 2/3 of that sort of real estate, right? If you want to think about it that way. The Hashemites were given control of that. They're a family that's connected to the Caliphate. And that's, by all accounts, they've been good rulers. It's a monarchy. But I do think it's important to note that this sort of like created a much smaller piece of land that now we were discussing dividing in terms of a homeland for both folks. I'll say too that there's a lot of discussion that happens in terms of like, how did different people acquire different parts of the land? And so I want to give as a context, so one, to acknowledge that like things happened in 1948 that definitely American Jews and also Israelis need to do a better job acknowledging and coming to terms with in terms of Palestinians and Arabs that were treated poorly and attacked and driven out, in the same way that I think a lot of us here need to do a better job, broadly speaking, not speaking to any particular person here, but like broadly speaking, Americans need to do a better job of acknowledging some of the things that happened at the founding of our country, and as we expanded west and what happened there. I think that's important to note. And I think there are also pieces of the narrative that sometimes feel conflicting, but can be true in both, kind of both conflicting narratives can have truth in them. And so the one that I'll just share with you, and you know, however you want to think about it, is there is sort of a narrative that is that Palestinians that were generations on this land were kicked off their family land, and now had nowhere to go, and they were told like, you have to leave. And there is also a narrative that says that Jews purchased land legally from the owners and came and moved, like they didn't do anything wrong, right? Like this land, a chunk of it was purchased legally even prior to the establishment of the state of Israel. And I just want to note that these are actually both true things, and sometimes talking about the same piece of land, because many of the owners of the land were absentee landowners. They had tenant farmers, they had folks that were caretakers, families that were living for generations on the land, taking care of the land. And the assumption, like if the ownership changed, they stayed there. That was what they considered their land. And some of the Jewish families and Jewish institutions purchased the land, but they wanted to live on the land and be there. And so they came and they said, okay, that's great, but now we own this land and we want to farm it. We want to do things with it. And so you can think what you like about, right, if that was good or bad or what it was, but I do think that it's important to sort of consider that there are sort of these narratives that sometimes feel like they are conflicting, and often there are real elements of truth to both of them, and they inform the way people are thinking about their stories and their connections to the land and sort of who has a right to be somewhere in particular. So that's one piece. In terms of some of the things, and I apologize, I just got a text that I have to respond to for 2 seconds, and I'm gonna lose my train of thought if I type without. Many, many apologies. So that's one piece. I think another thing that I would just say is 1948, when there was a proposal from to divide the land, the Jews that were living currently in Israel, in Palestine at the time, said, okay, this isn't what we wanted, we're going to accept it. The Palestinians, right, the people that identify as Palestinian, the Arabs that were actually living there, are not actually the folks that had an opportunity to approve or disapprove of that proposal. It was leaders from surrounding Arab countries. And those are the leaders that said, no, this is not acceptable. And I point that out only because while it may or may not be that the folks that were living there would have agreed or disagreed, I don't know. I do think that it's important because what has happened since then in terms of displacement and where folks have been and the uh, status of refugee, things like that, stems from something that the folks directly affected did not really have a lot of say in. And as someone who is not Palestinian, but looking from the outside at the situation in this instance, to me, it looks like the Palestinians have essentially been used as political pawns for a very long time by both Israeli governments and also by surrounding Arab governments. So all of that to sort of say, there's a lot of pieces to the story. There's a lot of history. The other piece that I'll toss out there, and again, this is because I think it's important to have some of this context and how people are thinking about it, is at the same time that approximately, right, 750,000, I believe, Palestinians, Arabs, left from the area. So during what they would refer to as the Nakba, left from the current state of Israel and ended up in refugee camps and other surrounding countries. Approximately the same number, about 850,000 Mizrahi Jews, so Jews who had been living in Arab countries this whole time, in Iraq, in Iran, in actually Egypt as well, in some of those countries, were kicked out of their homes with the establishment of the state of Israel. And they made their way to the newly established state of Israel, and were taken in. There were issues. There was definitely, and those communities can speak for themselves, that is, I'm not going to pretend to speak for them. And again, lots of differentiation in terms of what they think or don't think about current policies in the state of Israel, things like that. But many of those families came after being literally run from their homes as well. And the state of Israel did take them in, and the current population in Israel, about over 50% of Israeli Jews have Sephardic or Mizrahi background. So those are in terms of they were from countries, they had been living for quite some time in some of those Middle Eastern countries, or from Spain, Morocco, North Africa, right? Non-European, right? So non-Ashkenazi Jews. And I think that that's also important to note because many of them feel like they don't have a home to anywhere else, right, to go back to as well. So what are sort of some of the big concerns? What are some of the things that maybe shifted after October 7th or in stuff coming up to it? One, I want to note that the attacks on October 7th were really shocking and horrific for many of us in the both Israelis but also the American Jewish community, both because of the sort of organization and the numbers that were killed and attacked and the violence that accompanied it, but also because of what many saw as a lack of response from the international community and a lack of acknowledgement, even within the US. There were more isolated, definitely not in a lot of places, but there were definitely instances of organizations and definitely individuals who posted immediately that this was a form of legitimate resistance, that this was like a good thing. When you consider that this was 250 folks that were gunned down at a music festival, these were families that were burned in their homes, folks that were raped. To hear someone then say, like, this was an act of legitimate resistance was really shocking for folks, and really disturbing in terms of if you view this as legitimate resistance, what does that mean about how you're going to view like my safety? Like, can I trust you to care for my own safety if this is how you're viewing these acts? And so there is a piece that both folks were mourning and also wanting to get hostages back. And yes, also for many people felt like there should be some sort of retaliation. And, for good or bad. I don't think, if I think many of the folks on this call, right? Like if you can think back to kind of what happened shortly after September 11th, right? Back in 2001, and the way, not everyone, but the way many people felt like, well, what are we going to do now to like retaliate and get back at the people that caused sort of this massive thing that we weren't expecting and we didn't know what led up to it, and like how did all that affect things. There is no doubt in my mind, I'll just say, from the things I've read and the folks I've talked to, right? But I am not an international law expert. I am not a politician, right? So I just want to be clear. But that there were, and it has been reported, huge gaps of intelligence where intelligence was ignored by Netanyahu's administration in Israel. It is also very clear that from most things that I've seen, and I would just say from what I know, that it is likely Hamas knew what a Netanyahu's government, what type of response they would have to this sort of attack. Folks can argue whether that's good or bad, but I think that that's important to note. Prior to these attacks, the Israelis had been protesting Netanyahu's government pretty consistently. Every week, they had hundreds of thousands showing up and protesting in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem to try to call for elections in opposition to judicial reforms Netanyahu was proposing, and also in opposition to other things that the government was doing. Israel has if you're not familiar with it, something called a parliamentary democracy. They only stay in power if they maintain a majority. And so you can go into elections at any time. If someone pulls out of the coalition that creates the majority and Netanyahu no longer has a majority, you have elections. You're not like stuck in with that government until whatever date, right? 2016, 2022, whatever, like we are here. So it is a different type of pressure that happens in the society there when you have that sort of protest and that sort of pressure. So that's important to note. And now, 6+ months later, there was a point right after the attacks when folks really were not protesting anymore. They were more focused in Israel on what was happening. Those protests have started again. The other week, a couple weeks ago, there were over 10,000 that were out protesting. There are two different protests. One is families of hostages that are really pushing for a ceasefire deal for the negotiations to get their loved ones back. The other is about some, again, judicial reforms and also some policies that are in place in Israel that exempt the ultra-Orthodox from their military service. And for us, while those protests were separate and more recently they've combined, there are also groups of coexistence groups, so Palestinians and Israelis that have been working together. A big one is Standing Together. They have an English page as well, which actually I would highly recommend you look at. They are very intentional in making sure their leadership has equal representation from Palestinians and Israelis. Have been protesting for quite some time as well in terms of trying to advocate for more aid into Gaza and for ceasefire for both the release of hostages and also humanitarian purposes. So that's something. Within Israeli society and also the conversation in many parts of the Jewish American community, when folks are thinking about sort of what are next steps and what should be happening, I'll say this. I have not heard anyone advocate. I know that there are Israeli politicians that have, right? So I just want to acknowledge that. But I have not heard anyone advocate, like in terms of folks here in America, stuff like that, specifically, right? No one wants to be bombing Gazan civilians. No one wants to have folks being displaced. But there is also a feeling from many that when you talk about that without also talking, at least acknowledging that there were, for example, right after October 7th, over 200,000 Israelis displaced from their homes. And now there's still over almost 140, I think it's like 135,000 are still displaced from their homes, both along near the Gaza envelope, that border, and also in the north where Hezbollah has been bombing from Lebanon, that it is hard for folks to reconcile calls for ceasefire when it is not just one direction that is bombing. Sorry, that was worded very poorly, and I apologize. Right? Bombs are still coming from Gaza into Israel. Bombs are coming from Lebanon into Israel. And so there is a feeling that is sometimes expressed when folks say, ceasefire, well, what kind of ceasefire are you talking about? And like I have my own thoughts about what should or shouldn't be happening there, and I'm happy to share. But I think more importantly is to understand that these are real security concerns. And I know there were some things brought up last week that got mentioned, right? And we can talk about like US military aid to Israel and what that looks like. And often that's in the form of sort of guarantees, like money that then they spend to purchase munitions and stuff. And some of that is for Iron Dome, which is missile defense, versus armaments, right, that would be bombing. And so I think the sheer number of rockets that also has been fired into Israel, this is a real concern when people start to talk about, like, should we stop all aid to Israel? And there might be a place for that. I have one Israeli relative who basically has said it's up to Biden to put more pressure on Netanyahu because Netanyahu's not going to do it on his own. I don't think that is the majority view from Israelis. But it's a chunk. So, for example, in the 6 months leading up to October 7th, so from April to the beginning of October in 2023, there were over 1,600 rockets that were fired from Gaza into settlements near the envelope there. Since October 7th, there have been 12,000 rockets fired from Gaza into Israel. There have been additional rockets, like I said, fired from Lebanon into Israel. There has not been the damage and the casualties in Israel primarily because of the Iron Dome system, because of the defense system. That's good. It's not good that the Gazans, that they don't have something like that, right? So like, I want to be really clear that like nothing that I'm saying is meant to justify anything that is going on, but to just try to sort of frame so folks can understand like why Israelis and also why some folks within the Jewish community, many folks in terms of like in Jewish organizations and stuff, are so concerned and pushing so much for some of this funding and for certain things, because there is a real deep-seated fear that without those defense systems, there really would be casualties on the Israeli side that would be like even more disproportionate to what we're seeing in the other in Gaza. So those are sort of some sort of bigger basic concerns and things that folks are seeing. I think something else that's really important to note is that in February, Biden, for the first time, and this is to my knowledge, as far as I am aware, the first time that any US president has done this, Biden issued an executive order that actually targets Israeli settlers in the West Bank accused of attacking Palestinians. And also they've also been accused of attacking Israeli peace activists. And it imposed financial sanctions and visa bans. So there was an initial round that was against 4 individuals with the idea that this would be expanded. So I think, well, I know there have been a lot of folks that have sort of tried to have said, and again, this is not, you know, a defense of anything else that happens, but like tried to say that the current administration, right, or folks are not doing anything. But there is a lot that is happening, I think, a little more behind the scenes to try to really address some of the things that are going on and to try to limit damage that is happening. I think the US, Qatar, other countries are really working to help to broker negotiations. I think there is also, well, let me back up for just a moment and I'll just say this. So on my social media feed, which, you know, you can always take with a grain of salt, I have friends and acquaintances who are feel very, very differently about many issues, but this issue in particular, I'll just say, right? And what I have seen is one group is constantly posting every time Hamas rejects a ceasefire deal, with no mention of any of the offers that the Israeli government has rejected. And a different group is posting over and over about all the times the Israeli government has rejected ceasefire deals, with no mention of the times that Hamas has rejected ceasefire deals, right? And it's creating a binary that I think people are pretty aware of, right? That is becoming more and more polarized, where everyone is sort of looking in their own bubble for a little bit of confirmation bias, but also to sort of say like, see, I'm right. This is the bad guy. This is the bad guy. This person is, you know, evil, or this person should be demonized. And I think that becomes really dangerous. It becomes dangerous for Israelis, for Palestinians, but it also becomes dangerous, I think, for Muslim and Jewish communities in the US. And so this is part of that sort of nuance, right? And the complication that there is a lot that is happening. There's a lot of information. There is a lot that's going on, and there are a lot of people with a lot of different views. So I want to pause for a sec. I realized that I apologize because I think it wasn't quite as concise, right, as like points, and I apologize if it felt like it wandered a little bit. But there are, I think, a number of considerations that folks have. I'm going to share a little just from my personal opinion in terms of, I both believe there should be ceasefire. I have signed letters to that effect, and I have been told by folks that I would consider colleagues that that's not, I shouldn't be doing that because of the position I have. And I've also been told by folks that it's not enough. I've chosen to sign on with Jewish organizations that have been very clear about a need for both a release of hostages and bilateral ceasefire. For me, that's really important. And again, folks that I know that hold more divergent opinions on both sides have sort of come at me for that. But I do want to share what I believe with you all a little bit, because, you know, like any other source of information, you should evaluate everything you're being told by the source, right? You read something in Al Jazeera, they have great reporting. Also, they're owned by the government of Qatar, which was sheltering the leaders of Hamas. So like everything, right? IDF, Hamas, everyone who's involved, you can trust or distrust a source, but like know where your sources are coming from. I also do not think the use of the terms genocide, apartheid, right, things like that, in reference to some of the things going on and that were happening even prior to October 7th, are helpful or accurate. If we think about apartheid, there is no doubt that Israeli society has, just like every other society, some issues with racism, right? I don't think it is accurate to say that there is, for citizens, an apartheid system. 20% of Israeli citizens are Arabs, either Christian or Muslim Arabs, because there are also Jewish Arabs. They have parties in government. They are not restricted from particular jobs. That doesn't mean there's not discrimination, just like in this country, right? For things, those are ongoing issues that folks deal with. When you talk about what's happening, folks living in the West Bank, you're not talking about citizens of Israel. And so, yes, there are differences in how folks are treated. And also, I think it's important to think about what the terminology means and to acknowledge that as well. I'll just say that it could get to that point if Israel were to choose to annex Gaza or parts of the West Bank and not provide citizenship, then yes, you would have something that, in my opinion, would be an apartheid system. I don't think that's where it is now. And I get concerned about using terms that I think are very emotional and evocative of those emotions, because it also leads to this idea that Israelis, which sometimes bleeds into Jews, are sort of fundamentally beyond redemption or somehow evil. And we have seen in the US some folks that have taken some of the things that have happened and used it to sort of cover some real calls for violence against Jews. And I'll just say I have a friend in Pittsburgh whose house was vandalized and who was targeted. I have colleagues in New York who had death threats made to them and against them and their families by folks at protests. Like these are real things that are concerns. And so there are places where I think some things are exaggerated in the press, and also places where things maybe are not being reported that are happening, and folks are fearing for their safety. Okay, now I really am going to pause. Sorry, and then I just got diverted on a tangent again. But I do want to be able to take questions. I do want to answer. And again, like I'm giving you my perspective. I've looked at this a lot. I've studied it. I'm immersed in it. I talk to a lot of people about this on a pretty daily basis. But also, you know, it's it's my opinion, ultimately, not trying to tell anyone else how they need to think. So I don't know if someone who's moderating wants to call on folks, or I'm happy to call when I see hands up.
I will do that. Let me ask the first question. You are leader of an organization that I'm sure has some real diversity of opinion in terms of what's going on over there. How is that playing out at Hillel, and are there issues? How are they being handled?
Yeah. So I'll say Hillel is both an international organization, and also we sort of have, I guess, maybe what you would consider almost like franchises, right? Or something at the different universities. So different Hillels have different cultures. That depends on the students, the schools they're at, the things they want to do. We definitely serve, I work with and serve students that have a diversity of opinion in terms of if they feel like the current strategy in Gaza is justified or not, if they feel like there should or should not be ceasefire, if it should be bilateral, right? There is that full range. There are places and times where it gets contentious, but I think it is important to be able to have the conversations and for people to be able to express how they feel. And at least I can really only speak for what is happening here at like our Hillel here at the University of Missouri. And we have worked very hard to create a space that is open to all students and that where they can express those different opinions in a respectful way and still be served and still honestly just do the things that we want to do, which is we celebrated Passover and we're celebrating Shabbat and we're helping students who are studying for finals, right? And like all the other pieces of the job.
Sue and Herb, I think, had the first question.
May I defer to the next in line in favor of David Luthold, my professional colleague?
My question is, what is happening on the University of Missouri campus, and what should be happening, in your opinion?
I actually think that what is happening is what should be happening right now. The University of Missouri campus has been, students have modeled real respectful dialogue and ways of engaging with one another and expressing their opinions, generally speaking, right, without major incidents. I know that there is a variety of opinions. Certainly there are like Columbia University, NYU, right? There are things happening, other places that maybe are, even when I don't agree with some of the protests, I also don't agree with how some of the administrations have handled them, right? I'll just say. And I think that what we have seen, what I have seen, and when I've heard from students here, Jewish students here feel relatively safe and respected. There have been isolated incidents that folks feel are targeted or anti-Semitic. And I also know that there are Muslim students that have, and potentially Palestinians that have also felt the same way. But what I am aware of, it is relatively calm is maybe not quite the right word, but it is sort of, people are aware and they're taking actions that they feel are appropriate and expressing themselves, but doing so in ways that are not harmful to others.
Okay.
I was just going to ask if I could address, I saw that there was a question in the chat, which was, how complete is media coverage of the Gaza invasion inside Israel? What do average Israeli citizens know of what things are like in Gaza? So I think just like in this country, some of that depends on what news outlets you are reading. right? So certainly Israelis, many speak English quite fluently and have access to American news sources. Israeli news sources, I think, are covering things a little bit differently. And I'll note that also Arab media is covering things differently as well, right? Again, back to that, know what your source is. But discontent with Netanyahu and with his government, discontent with the fact that it has been over 200 days and hostages are still missing. There was just a video that was released the other day of one of the hostages, Hirsch, whose mother was just had some international recognition kind of the day before. So there is more awareness of different things. There are definitely Israelis that are organizing to try to get more humanitarian aid into Gaza. There are Israelis that are protesting both what Netanyahu's government is doing and also what they're not doing. What they see is sort of those two pieces of what they see. And there are more and more Israelis who are starting to ask the question, which I know, again, was raised last week too, of what does this look like after? How do you determine that a campaign, right, is done? And what do those next steps look like?
Alice?
But wait a minute, he gave up his turn.
Yeah.
Herb,
Okay.
continue.
I was going to make a note that you might first, before I ask the hard question, you might want to edit your account of the history up to independence in 48. There's lots of good stuff out there from various places. If you'd be most comfortable with it, there's a wonderful string of historical narratives that have come out of the Arab Israeli Research Group at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, led by Yoshafat Harkabi when he revitalized that. He'd been a graduate student just a couple of years ahead of me. Anyway, but the big question I'd like to focus this on is what to do next with this intractable problem. What should the current government of Israel do or not do? And what should the United States do or not do, recognizing that we too are not, I repeat, not allies, as the Prime Minister have repeatedly tells the world.
You're saying, like, as Netanyahu has said, that we're not allies, or you just muted yourself, sorry, right before you.
Or we say that we're not alive.
No, there is no treaty of alliance between the United States and Israel, unlike what we have with a bunch of other countries. And the Prime Minister has repeatedly made that point. It shows up in, I don't know if it shows up in the Columbia Missourian, but it shows up many places. There's never been a time when both Israel and the United States were willing to embrace that at the same time.
Yeah, so
That's
in terms of, no, in terms of like, what should the current Israeli government do or not do? I mean, I'll just be very clear in my personal politics that what I hope happens is that the current Israeli government is no longer the current Israeli government. Again, there's parliamentary democracy gives a lot of power, not so dissimilar to what happens in our case sometimes, where you have one or two, right, folks that might be the swing votes, so to speak, that end up with an inordinate amount of power. But because they have to keep their coalition formed, some of the ultra-Orthodox groups and really hard-right groups that make up just a few of those seats, but those are the seats that are keeping them in power, tend to have a lot of influence. I think that there is great consensus that people want the hostages back. I think there is, and that people do not feel that Hamas should be allowed to continue to be the ruling government in Gaza for many reasons. There is much less consensus about the right strategy to get the hostages back and to get Hamas out of power. And I think that's where you see all the tricky, right? Like there are folks that are advocating and saying the bombing, which, right, is because Hamas needs to be thoroughly destroyed, and they're not thoroughly destroyed. And you have others who have pointed out, based on both US and other experiences elsewhere, right, that you might destroy the current or kill the current Hamas leadership, but if you have enough folks with dead relatives, you're going to give rise to a whole new group of folks that are going to take up that cause, right, and are going to see Israelis as the reason that their family, you know, was killed or they've experienced this hardship. So I know what I would like to see happen. I don't know that there is a leader right now in Israel that has the political will to enforce a lot, but there are growing movements, again, of both Palestinians and Israelis that are both speaking out against Hamas and speaking out against Netanyahu's government and asking for a change and asking for a vision of what does it look like after. And I don't think the thing that I think that is really hard and like hard for me as an American Jew, and I think definitely hard for many of our institutions, is to really recognize that the solution is not going to come from me. It has to come from Israelis and Palestinians, because they are the ones that have to do it. And also many of them are already doing it and living it on the ground, right? Like they are living life with each other right now. Their leadership is not allowing that to continue and allowing that to happen. So I don't have a great answer for you, because I don't know what the solution is beyond to just keep creating connections and keep, I am a big believer in the ability of grassroots movements. I personally try to support a lot of the coexistence movements that are there in Israel and folks that are doing some of the work on the ground, in terms, including groups that are using, just like here, right, the court system to try to make sure that Palestinians and Arab Israelis are having all their rights that they're entitled to under law acknowledged and held and things like that. So that's kind of what I have. I'm sorry, I don't have something something better for you. I wish I could solve it all.
So, Jeannie, I just wanted to follow up a little bit with that train, some of what you said I thought about 50% of Israelis are secular Jews, and past leaders of Israel have been very different, many of them leaning more as being secular Jews. And at the outset of this war, almost 100% of the Jewish community that I know in Colombia and my congregation were terrified. The word is terrified that Netanyahu was in charge of this war. Last week, I asked a question, and following up on something David said, that, well, what if we stop the weapons to Israel? If Biden took that step, would that make a difference? I said that to a progressive who is Jewish running for a statewide office in Missouri. And he said to me, if Netanyahu's government was out, you would have a more conservative government because of the incredible fear in Israel right now. Incredible fear after that slaughter. And so, I mean, it's such a difficult situation. It's so horrendous. But, and again, you're right. They aren't necessarily our allies. We help them for a lot of, it's in our need to help Israel in a lot of ways, with Iran, whatever. And not agreeing to a two-state solution, I was shocked. That opened my eyes. I guess I hadn't wanted to see that. Anyway,
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the thing about so Netanyahu, so I'll say this. When I was a junior studying abroad in college, that was the year Rabin was assassinated, as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk. They had elections, right? And I very clearly remember riding the bus back from Sfat. I had taken a day trip and sitting next to an Israeli soldier, a woman, so someone who was basically my age at the time, and talking to her about what Israelis were going to do. Like, what was this vote going to be? Because the vote was really seen at the time as a referendum on, was there going to continue to be support for the Oslo Accords for this idea of land for peace? Or was this like kind of the end of all of that? And the outcome of the vote notwithstanding at the time, what she said to me, which like I think about actually a lot, and I think about like, where is she? Because as someone my age, she probably has, if she did anything close to me in terms of like, you know, when she got married or had kids or stuff, like she basically has kids in the IDF right now, or potentially that were recently out of the IDF or about to be. And what she said was like, I'm gonna vote for the candidates that support land for peace because I don't want my kids to be doing this. And I don't know what other options we have. And I think about that a lot because that was 27 years ago, right? At this point, which means there's now a whole generation that's grown up without the idea that like this can be a workable solution. And that's maybe a little pessimistic, but I think about it because I wonder, right? Like, what do we do next? And yes, Netanyahu has been in and out of government, right? Like at that point, that was Sharon, but like for almost this entire time. And right now he's one of the more center folks of his coalition, which is very different than how it has been in the past. I am not an expert on all the different parties. I will admit that I have trouble keeping some of them straight and have to look up sometimes like which ones are which. The outside of the big ones, because there's a lot. They have like a pirate party and they have, you know, whatever. Anyone can run. You can. It's a great system. So yeah, and Netanyahu is he's a politician, right? Like he wants to be in power, and he has figured out ways to do that. So I don't know if it would be a more conservative right-wing coalition if Netanyahu was out. I think there are some folks that are in his coalition right now that have stayed in because the country sees itself at war, that might provide some alternatives, Gantz and some others. But again, that is Israeli politics, I feel like changes even more so than American politics in terms of like the people and the personalities, except for Netanyahu, who somehow seems to just stay. But that's separate. So.
Steve Calloway, you had a hand up. Did you have a question? Not. Were there any other questions? Pam, you're muted.
The Iron Dome, is it something that we have to keep sending money to keep it up?
So from my understanding of it, the technology and that is there, but it functions by sending missiles to intercept other missiles. So the armament, the missiles themselves that provide that defense I believe are part of many of the aid packages. And so when you talk about like, should we cut aid, right? Things like that, I think I'll say my personal opinion, if there were a way, or if there is some way to differentiate, and I don't know because I really don't know how they separate that, but if there is some way to differentiate between, right, like aid for the missiles that would be used in the Iron Dome system compared to ones that might be used for more offensive maneuvers, I think that's where it gets tricky. And I'll just say what I hear from other folks too, right, in terms, especially within the Jewish community, who get concerned of like, well, if we pull the money and there's nothing for Iron Dome, then what happens when Iran sends 300 drones and missiles, right? Because what do the casualties and what does everything look like then if you aren't able to intercept them? I don't know what the answer is. Like
Yeah. That would be interesting to find out. Another question, you made the statement that both the Israelis and the Palestinians use the Palestinians for pawns. Can you explain that a little more?
I think the refugee status and the way that they are used. So Netanyahu for sure. Netanyahu, and this is something that has come out more in the press more recently. It was out there before that I know, is part of why Israelis are really particularly upset. Netanyahu helped to prop up Hamas because by having both Hamas and the PA, there was an excuse to say, well, who do we negotiate with? There is no single representative of the Palestinian people, right? So we can't negotiate a two-state solution. We can't negotiate because there is no one who actually is representing these people. And so I don't think Netanyahu is the only one, but so governments in Israel, right? Like, and the status has been that. And in terms of less Palestinians using other Palestinians, but also I think it's more about the, quite honestly, governments in some of the other Arab countries. And I think that there has to be attention to any final solution is going to have to include surrounding Arab countries, Jordan and Egypt and Syria and stuff, right? They have money, they have resources. When Jordan had control of the West Bank for many, many years, they didn't make the Palestinians living there citizens. They could have said, this is now part of Jordan and you are citizens. And so this is when I was talking before, right? When people talk about like the Mizrahi, the Jewish refugees that came from the Arab countries and were absorbed and became citizens. This is the sort of, sorry, I'm trying to think of the right word, like it's not a justification, but like, this is sort of the dichotomy that people see, or like why it gets mentioned, right? That like, well, Israel took these folks in and made them citizens, and now they're no longer refugees, right? Like they just are citizens. And so even though they had these other homes that they may or may not have wanted to go back to. And so when you've kept a population specifically as refugees and not provided the resources for them to move out of poverty, right? Or where their conditions are kept in a certain way, it is both a way that Arab countries point to and they say like, see what Israel has done to these people. And I'm not denying that like Israel has played a part, right? I want to be really, really clear about that. Like, I think that this is like, there are a lot of things that come into play. But I think that Palestinians have not always been allowed to speak for themselves, and I don't want to speak for them either. Like I'm trying really, really hard. But like the people, you have a lot of other Arab governments talking about what Palestinians need. And you also have the PA and Hamas that I'm not sure fully represent the best interests of the Palestinian people. And younger Palestinians in the West Bank, for example, that I've talked to, they definitely don't think the PA represents them. They don't necessarily think Hamas does either. They're not fans of them, but they definitely don't think the PA represents them. There haven't been elections in pretty much in their lifetime.
Right.
So does that clarify
Yeah,
a little?
I want to thank you. I think you've given us a very balanced program, and I've learned a lot. So I appreciate your trying to be very empathetic about what is happening there. It really is very convoluted.
Yeah, thank you very much for coming and presenting on this.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Again, it's, there's a lot, and I don't know if anyone fully agrees with me. We can all have our own opinion about this stuff,
Right.
but
Do you think it would do any good to put more pressure on President Biden?
I really don't know. I think that Biden is doing a lot, and I think that diplomacy is not a fast thing, right? Like, and that's a reality, like even like the initial hostage deal. So I don't know what the answer is. I really don't. I hesitate to advocate like to say like we should do this or we shouldn't do that. I do think that there are things Biden has done that are really good starts. In terms of, like I said, some of these sanctions against Israeli settlers and folks that they know have been accused of violence. In terms of trying to be part of negotiations, I think the US is in a unique position to be able to maybe be a mediator along with Qatar and some of the other folks, and I hope it works. I don't know, like I don't know where else to go from here.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Let's see, Pam,